Sure. So my name is KP Naidu. I'm the VP of Labs at Benetech. And Benetech is an organization which is focused on developing software for the nonprofit sector. And our tagline is software for social good. And that's all we do. And we've been doing that for 20 years. I've been with Benetech for just under a year now. I joined in October of last year. And my areas of focus in labs is basically around developing solutions for a couple of different areas, but mainly around what are we doing for the social safety net and connecting organizations or working the social safety net to be able to exchange information around their services, their eligibility criteria, the general information about their organization, and really about their capacity and availability. And this stemmed from a need for the information and referral agencies to be able to keep their resource databases in sync, so to speak, right? So there's lots of these silos of resource databases which are there in the Bay Area as well as throughout the country, and a lot of them are out of sync because they rely on making phone calls to keep that data updated. So ServiceNet basically is a platform which enables them to share their information and keep that data up to date, so to speak. And we can talk more about this and why it's relevant. And then a couple of other areas of focus which we have is for people with disabilities, for them to be able to understand what their rights are under the UNCRPD internationally, or under the ADA and a patchwork of other laws which we have locally. And then more importantly, for them to be able to report back in terms of what their lived experience is. So, so that is another area. And then we are working with AI and machine learning tools to develop or to actually analyze videos to be able to fingerprint them, identify a unique fingerprint for every video, and also to be able to analyze videos which relate to the same location, different points of view, or same location, different points in time, or to find markers or artifacts which happen in the video. And the use cases that we're analyzing videos which are coming out of the Syrian conflict. And the idea being that we can identify specific events which happen in those videos, if there's a helicopter overhead or there's a bomb explosion or anything else. And then, so we're helping local organizations on the ground who are collecting these videos to be able to share and analyze those videos. And eventually maybe they will be used for any prosecutions which may be necessary as part of for the International Criminal Court. So I'll stop there, and that's my introduction. Thank you for having me, Nathan. This is very good. And Andrew, great to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you.
Andrew, you can go ahead. Next.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So I'm Andrew Henning. I have been working on homelessness, affordable housing, and poverty alleviation in the Bay Area for over a decade now. I moved to Silicon Valley from Virginia about 10 years ago through AmeriCorps Vista. And since then, I've had the chance to do frontline street outreach to homeless encampments in the Silicon Valley area, coordinate homeless outreach events, do workforce development, so both helping people get jobs one-on-one, designing workforce development programs, running a program and an organization where we actually essentially employ people experiencing homelessness to come and volunteer and regain work experience by beautifying their communities and volunteering to rebuild their work experience. And then the past 4 years, I've been working with the city of San Rafael as the director of homeless planning and outreach. And basically through that, I've been helping to sort of, with obviously a bigger team, set the strategic direction for how we're addressing homelessness in Marin County. For those of you who are watching who are not familiar with Marin County, Marin is essentially a smaller, wealthy suburb of San Francisco. So if you were to imagine the Golden Gate Bridge, we're just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. So the other side of it from San Francisco. And despite the affluence, a few years ago, Marin had the 7th highest per capita rate of homelessness in the entire country. So some pretty significant systemic problems that we can go into more detail about. But because of the changes that we've implemented, and part of that involves this group that I helped co-found, Opening Doors Marin. In 2019, we were actually one of only 20% of counties in California that saw measurable reductions in homelessness. And in one case, chronic homelessness, which has really been our focus. So that's long-term homelessness. We had an almost 30% reduction. And a lot of that was driven by systems thinking and human-centered design. So really, as I've been learning more about these tools, I got my MBA from UC Berkeley a few years ago while I was doing all this work. So that's kind of how I got introduced to a lot of these concepts, and just been trying to apply them ever since.
That's great. Well, Andrew, you kind of dovetailed really nicely into the next kind of topic, or the thinking processes. What is systems thinking? You both work deeply in poverty alleviation locally, and you probably have a front row view more than anyone that it's not just you can't just solve something one-sidedly. You have to have so many stakeholders are part of that process. So it'd be great to hear from your perspective how you define systems thinking and the role that you feel it plays in poverty alleviation. And Andrew, you're still up on my screen, so you're welcome to first if you have.
Sounds good. Yeah. So, so it's interesting. So I would say, when I started getting my MBA, I'd probably been working in this field for maybe 7 years at that point. And it was interesting because halfway through the program, kind of two things happened. One was I had this sort of existential question, if you will, on the job of, I've been doing this for, again, 7 years now. I've helped a lot of people. Our organization's helped a lot of people. Our partners have helped a lot of people get jobs, get housing. Like, I know we're having an impact on some level. And yet homelessness, particularly in the Bay Area in California, is getting worse and worse and worse. And it just was not jiving. Like, why is that happening? And at the same time, I was able to, through a mentor at UC Berkeley, Sarah Beckman, took this incredible class called Reimagining Slums, which was basically using the systems thinking toolkit, the human-centered design toolkit, to look at essentially these kind of informal housing situations all around the world, both internationally, but also, let's be honest, in some American cities, some wealthy American cities, where you see encampments and other, camp setups for people that are unsheltered and are outside. And it was through that class and systems thinking specifically, which I would sort of define as, it's, a little bit kind of nebulous, but I think it's really that taking a step back and looking at the big picture of all of the different causes, all of the different aspects of an issue. And rather than pinning it down to one explanation for homelessness, for example, it's just about housing, actually seeing how it's housing, it's the labor market, it's the mental health system, it's systemic racism, and how all of that is coming together to actually cause this issue. And so for me, we were able to ultimately apply that lens of thinking both to the broader, I think, socioeconomic environment in Marin County about what was causing people to become homeless in the first place. But we were also able to apply it to the system, the homeless system of care. And as KP said earlier, really mapping out for the first time, what were the silos really like in practice? I think we all knew kind of in theory, like, yes, we're siloed. Yes, there's broken communication. Yes, people aren't having good outcomes. The referrals are breaking down. But really, that was the first time we really mapped it out and could see it. And once you see it, it's just like, wow, this is so broken. And so that exercise and that systems level perspective really allowed us to then kind of blow up the whole thing and start over. And that's, I think, what led to a lot of the results that we've had.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on that, Andrew. I think you painted the picture absolutely accurately. That is, very often I'm new to this, right? So I come from a background of, developing commercial systems and working in technology for a long time. And you're kind of in that world, you're kind of used to doing what you mentioned, right? Which is look at all of the pieces. How do they fit together? If we're developing a solution, does this actually work or not? Where are the friction points? What are the causes of some of your anomalies, if you like, which happen, right? Whereas you come into this world and it's an odd mix. You mentioned, like, people think, oh, it's just a homeless problem, so let's just go provide homeless shelters and then magically the problem will disappear. Well, it doesn't, right? So even if you do have homeless shelters, it doesn't disappear. Oh, it's a mental health issue. They're all substance abusers, and so let's go deal with that problem. And so these various point solutions kind of pop up, and they don't necessarily mesh well together because they haven't, people haven't thought about it. That's one. The second thing is, as you rightly pointed out, Andrew, and I think, I'm glad that you're saying this, because when I talk about this to people and I say, look, just from my point of view, there is no one size fits all. If you go into, you talk to 3 homeless people, the reasons for why they ended up homeless could be completely diverse. It could be because of racism, because of ageism. It could be because of a domestic situation. It could be because of, they're a veteran there are veterans who are homeless. There's all sorts of issues, or they're formerly incarcerated and then they've come out and they don't have a place. So there's so many different issues which are there. And so systems thinking, from my perspective, is exactly what you said, Andrew, which is to step back and say, what are the issues which people are facing? What are the systems which are out there? What are the government systems which are out there, the agencies? What are the private agencies who are working? And how do you actually bring all of these together to go solve the problem for a person, right? At the end of the day, it has to solve a problem for a person. And it's not just a point solution. It's not something which is, all right, this is for you for this week. This has to be something which is sustainable. And so you've got to think about, okay, so we fix this immediate problem. Yeah, you need shelter. Now what's the next piece? And then what's the next piece? And how do we make sure that, we actually help somebody on the road to not only just coming out of homelessness, but also to stay, housed and stay, get productive and be a productive member of society, right? So I think that's what system thinking to me is. It's like this whole evolution you've got to kind of think about.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that, because, in a way, I think systems thinking can be a little bit scary in the sense of, like, it feels so large, so daunting. But like KP said, for us, I think the real difference maker was being open to mapping that bigger system, and definitely going through the process of mapping it and laying out all the issues. But like you said, really focusing on individuals and their stories to walk through it. So it wasn't just conceptual. So in those early days, it was really like, okay, here's Bob. Bob has been homeless in San Rafael for 30 years. What is his day like? Where does he go? What are the breakdowns along the way? And so it really, it's so important to use that individual story or stories to illustrate the bigger system, because without it, you're just not going to get to it. And I think KP's so right. Before we really embarked on this process, a lot of the time, people would be like, oh, like you said, there's people that have mental health issues, so we just need a new mental health program. Or there are people that have labor problems or problems getting a job, so we just need a new job training program. But it really was not fundamentally changing the system or really addressing the nuances of that person. And so ultimately we shifted towards this strategy where our goal became focusing on vulnerability, right, and really focusing on individual vulnerability and finding a way to objectively determine who really is the most vulnerable in our community. And then how do we deploy a strategy or tactic that's going to be, basically responsive to any level of vulnerability and trying to get someone back inside. And so if we hadn't gone through that individual level of identifying those challenges, I don't think we could have done that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'll let Neethal jump in if she has any other questions, but there's another point which I wanted to get across, which piggybacks on that.
Oh, please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Neethal. So, you touched on this, Andrew, and I think it's not just people who are homeless or poor. There's also people who are near poverty, right? So they're one step away from poverty. They're one step, they're one paycheck or one misstep, if you like, away from actually falling, into the social safety net and really requiring that, right? So, it was a shock for me. I've lived in the Bay Area for over 2 decades and never kind of thought about it because I've been, I live a very privileged existence. There's no question about it, right? So, but I was, went in and I was looking at some of the statistics, and it's just alarming. Andrew, you work in Marin County and in San Francisco. A lot of your work, which is done over there, and you can probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but the limit, if you like, for in San Francisco for a family of four to be able to kind of just barely get by is somewhere in the region of $117,000 per year. Okay, in Santa Clara County, it's $98,500 per year for a family of four. Well, that sounds like a lot, but on the flip side, and I was just explaining this to to some of my team, and the minimum wage is what, $15 and something per hour, right? So even if you assume that somebody's making $20 an hour, if you're working 40 hours a week, one full-time job, that still gets you to 40,000. If you're working two full-time jobs, that still gets you to 80,000. You're still below that level of being able to actually go manage your family and to provide for them. And that many of these jobs don't carry healthcare benefits. You got to pay for healthcare yourself. You got to pay your rental, and rental, as housing is really expensive in the Bay Area. There's, and if God forbid your kids, need health, so they have a health issue or they need something else, it's really, really expensive. And so, that's the other thing is like, do we catch people only after they tip over the edge? Or what can we actually do to make sure that they don't actually tip over the edge, right? So that's the other thing. These systems have to be such that we actually are able to support people before they fall over the edge, because then it's 2 or 3 times as more expensive to actually go deal with it, and the longer term impacts of that are enormous. And I don't know, I mean, Andrew, you have a more closer feel for this. So I'd love to hear your views on that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up. It's really interesting, and I think it's a really pivotal part of our story of how we started to kind of negotiate with that issue of poverty more generally, or kind of near homelessness, if you will. I think what's interesting about homelessness overall, and I think this is true of any system, is you kind of get what you measure. And the way that we measure homelessness across the entire United States is something called the homeless point in time count. So the way that works is that every odd year in January, the federal government requires communities to go out on one morning or evening in January, and literally with volunteers canvass the entire community and then count every person that they see who they think is homeless. And then they also count the number of people that are in shelter. And so that's kind of the snapshot of who's homeless at a given time. Now, of course, every 2 years, like the definition changes slightly. So like as a benchmark, it's not very reliable. And then of course, it's only as reliable as your count. But I think what's interesting is that, most people in the field will tell you that the actual number of people that are homeless is probably 5 to 10x what's counted. And part of that is because a lot of people are in this kind of near term or like near homelessness situation where they're couch surfing or staying on someone's couch, or, they're renting a room informally, subletting. And technically they're homeless, but there's no way that we can count that. And so I think that's so important. And like you said, it's preventing that homelessness on the front end. But what's, I think, really interesting, and it certainly challenged a lot of what I thought about homelessness was, so let's say someone's getting very close to becoming homeless. I think what a lot of communities have done, and we certainly had done, was to preference our resources, start taking our scarce resources and allocating them towards individuals who had just become homeless. And so what's interesting that we found over time, and what we're finding now that we've changed our system, is that in some other communities, so for example, in Toronto, they ran this kind of experiment in their shelter system where they would wait 2 weeks before they would assess someone once they'd been in the shelter. So like, let's say you lost your housing, you needed emergency shelter, you go to the shelter, they would wait 2 weeks before they would intervene with any services. And the reason was that what people have found is that for that, as soon as you become homeless, people are so motivated and oftentimes so still resilient that they can actually escape the experience of homelessness with very minimal government assistance or social service assistance. Or if they need something, it's like very, very minimal. And so I think what a lot of communities do, and it's well-intentioned, is to say, well, here's this group of people who are very recently homeless. Let's put all of our resources there. But you're actually just providing them those resources to the people who are most capable of self-resolving that situation. And so what's happened over time, and it was certainly the case in Marin, is that you have this other group of people who are extremely vulnerable, primarily because of substance abuse or mental health or developmental issues. And a lot of that was driven, again, at a systemic level by the closing of mental health facilities and things like that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So there have literally been people who were homeless for 40 years in Marin because of that systemic problem. But because the resources were not directed at those individuals, they could never resolve their homelessness. And so part of it was really reframing, and to me, this is a big part of systems thinking, is that inflow, like better understanding the inflow of who is becoming homeless and why, and pairing your resources to what they really need. And kind of saying, I think also that for that broader issue of poverty, and we can certainly debate this or talk about this, is it's almost like for the homeless system of care to realize our job is maybe not to solve that. We can advocate in that domain, but our job is really getting people housed as fast as possible and really focusing on that versus, I think sometimes it's easy to mission drift into all that prevention. And what the data shows is it's really, really hard to predict who's going to actually become homeless versus they're able to just figure something out for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing is also, and this is, I don't have the statistics around this, but there's this generally in talking to people, and sometimes with, even with policymakers, you would think who would know a little bit better about this and have more information. It's like, well, if you're homeless or if you're poor, in effect, you have done something wrong. And, it's all your fault, kind of, in a sense, right? So, and that's not true. I mean, there's so many cases, and it's not necessarily the individual's fault. There's a whole, set of circumstances which can lead somebody to a point where they become homeless, right? I mean, there's lots of these cases, and anecdotally, we've heard of people who are making, six-figure salaries and more, and who are now literally homeless, right? And there's a progression. Maybe they made some bad decisions along the way, but then to be penalized and penalized over and over and again for that bad decision, that is something which the system kind of, it reinforces, if you like, the the impact for you if you've made a bad decision, right? And so that is something which you've got to kind of think about. And so it's I think even for policymakers to kind of think about this, it's really important, and because they're allocating dollars, and in today's world, just from, I can talk for Santa Clara County, for example, what we're hearing and seeing in the county which I live in, and I think it's the same for most of the counties. COVID is the tip of the spear, right? So the actual tragedy behind that is also massive unemployment. And so all of these folk who've suddenly gone from having a job where they were able to make rent and pay their bills and what have you, to no job, and now they're having to rely on the safety net. And there's lots and lots and lots of people who are queuing up at food pantries or at food kitchens, or looking for shelter, or like you said, they're couch surfing or sharing an apartment with a friend or whatever it is. And so this is and in Santa Clara County, for example, the out of an $8.3 billion budget, they have it's $1.7 billion is discretionary spend, and they're expecting a shortfall primarily because of COVID of between $300 to $600 million. That is going to have a serious impact on safety net services and what money is available. And so it requires even more effort on the part of service providers and community-based organizations to really think about what problem are we solving, and for who are we solving, and how do we actually go about solving that problem, right? So systems thinking, if you like, or coordinated working becomes even more important.
I think it's so true. I mean, I think what's interesting living in such a progressive part of the country, or such a, kind of allegedly liberal part of the country, is that I think if you ask, the typical Bay Area resident, do you want homelessness? Do you want housing that's affordable? Do you want people to have a living wage? People would support these things, across the board, of course. I mean, oh my gosh, how could I ever not support those things? But again, I think it really takes looking at the systemic nature of a lot of our systems, because the systems are not producing the things that we say we value. And so even, going back to the South Bay, I remember, it's funny. So when I first, I'm now in my garage, I work from home now, like all of us. And it's funny, I feel like every year my office has gotten worse and worse. So when I first moved to the Bay Area, I was working out of San Jose City Hall, and I worked out of the housing department. And so we were on the 10th floor, and the City Hall in San Jose is absolutely gorgeous. It has floor to ceiling glass windows on every floor. The airport's downtown. So I would just sit at my desk, look out my window, and just watch planes fly over the horizon into the airport. And it was like, this is amazing. But I remember I'd be in staff meetings and I would be thinking, somehow San Jose has like the most expensive real estate in the country. And I would just look out the window and I just couldn't understand it, because there was so much space. And everywhere you looked, it was like, San Jose City Hall is right in the middle of Silicon Valley, and that kind of in the South Bay. And then, 10 miles in any direction, it's just houses and just all this space. And so I think what a lot of people miss is that I think in San Jose or Santa Clara County, it's something like 85% of the city is zoned for single family homes.
Yes.
Which means it is literally illegal to build apartment buildings. And so you can talk about living wage and, all this stuff till you're blue in the face. But that's the kind of policy where I think, people need to be really real with themselves of, this is the systemic barrier, the systemic throttle that's holding back the creation of housing that would actually make our society much more equitable. And so that's really where I think, at least for me, systems thinking has been this really powerful tool of unpacking, this difference between what people, myself, say and we value and profess, and then the actual outcome of the system and the society that we're living in.
Yeah.
This is such a great conversation. And I think you guys have really started diving deeper into, not taking an issue around local poverty and oversimplifying it. But now I have a challenge for you, because in this event, we're asking people in a fairly short period of time. You guys have been working on this for years with teams, but this is almost like an ignition or catalyzing event. If people can start thinking in this way, it's like what Andrew said, like, he took a class and that kind of changed his whole viewpoint. So with that in mind, sometimes it helps to have someone paint a picture. So I'm wondering if either or both of you can kind of paint a picture of, what does a systemic minded solution look like? Like, what does that look and feel like, so that when our folks are kind of brainstorming, they can say, oh, well, does it look like this? Does it have those elements of having multiple stakeholders or whatever else it may be? So maybe if you each could kind of map out one, maybe a solution that either you worked on or that you've seen that is more of a systemic solution, but more just for the purpose of understanding it through that painting of that solution. So kind of, like the 30,000 foot view of that. So.
Andrew, you want to go?
Sure. I'll take a crack. I guess the story that comes to mind is, so as I said, I've been working for the city of San Rafael for about 4.5 years, but I've been working in San Rafael for about 7 years. And so I had a little bit of experience in the city before I started working for the city. But I'll never forget my very first city council meeting where basically we went in and it was packed. I mean, like standing room only, and everyone there was very heated because the issue in front of the city council was whether or not the council should revoke the use permit for a downtown homeless service provider. And half the room was there to say, if we could just get rid of this service provider, all of our homelessness problems are going to be gone. And then the other half of the room is saying, actually, we need to double the services downtown because that's why there's so much homelessness downtown. And so ultimately, and I'm sitting there thinking, I think I've made a mistake. I shouldn't have taken this job. This is how we're going to figure this out. And so, going back to, really starting with the individual, I think, KP, like you were saying about sort of this typical sort of moralizing we do about who deserves help or not. So at that time in Marin, and I think it's the case in a lot of communities, the reality was, the complaints in the community were legitimate. I mean, there was an element of the homeless community that was, it's some of like the more unfortunate things that happened. There are people that were very mentally ill that would, scream at people on the street. They'd go into businesses and be very disruptive in the business. There'd be public defecation, use of drugs. And so, so it was really, pretty bad. But what we realized when we really drilled into it is that it was ultimately a very small universe of individuals that were causing a hugely outsized impact. And that was really where we started to define our problem space around chronic homelessness. And once we had this new definition of chronic homelessness, it really became about, well, what's causing chronic homelessness? What are, strategies for addressing it? And I would say, if you're trying to have a big solution fast, what really changed for us, I would almost say is like finding the right analogy. Like if you have a system that you're working in, imagine it as a completely different system. And so like, as an example, so I think this kind of status quo approach to homelessness is again, this moralizing one where it's like the people that are the most willing to engage, they're the ones that should get the help. But we started to flip that narrative and say, what if we treated our homeless system of care like an emergency room, for example? And so in an emergency room, let's say, KP, you have a broken arm, so you go into the emergency room, and then I come in an hour later and I'm having a heart attack. But, I'm angry, I'm disruptive, I'm intoxicated, it's my third heart attack. None of that really matters. It doesn't matter that you were there first. The issue is that I'm having the medical emergency, so I'm going to get prioritized for care. And so that's really how we had to start to pivot our system, because it was the opposite. It was very much the people that advocated were at the front of the line, and the people that were actually the sickest received the least amount of help. And so using that analogy, defining the problem space around that one particular group that I think was truly causing this outsized problem, that was really a key catalyst for us implementing everything else that we did. And fortunately, I think our hypothesis was correct, and that when we started to house those individuals, the kind of quote unquote misbehavior, if you will, plummeted. I mean, once we started housing people, they'd have 80% less police contacts, 60% less medical utilization. And so really, but it took that kind of like, almost like a PR campaign of using a new systemic analogy for what it was we were trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Andrew, you touch on something which is, I've been kind of thinking about this and talking to people. There's been a lot of debate in terms of housing, and everybody, you mentioned zoning, and it's all zoned for, single family housing. And so, we've had these discussions from Palo Alto, with my Rotary Club members, with, and even, locally in San Jose where I live, and, talking to people. Everybody says, like you said, yeah, we should have affordable housing. Absolutely. We should provide low cost housing and what have you. And the moment you say, well, there is a proposal to build one down the street, it's like everybody is up in arms. No, not here, not in our neighborhood, no, nothing, what have you. So that is one issue. The other thing is, there's this whole movement to say, oh, why don't you build an ADU, extend your house, or do something and provide some additional living space for either an individual or a small family or whatever. And this is where I think, policymakers need to really think about this, right? So the first thing they think about is, okay, yeah, you build your ADU, we're going to come and assess that ADU and we're going to tax it for revenue purposes. Well, if you take a city like Palo Alto, 40% of the people pay $800 or less in property tax. If they're going to build an ADU, the value of the ADU and the assessed value of the ADU for tax is going to double or triple their property tax. Nobody's going to do it, right? So that's not going to happen. So, people really need to rethink. If the person is actually going to invest 50, 60, in some cases even $100,000 to actually build an ADU, let them recoup that money. The city is not hurting for that revenue right now that you've got to reassess and you've got to get that revenue. In fact, actually helping somebody to find affordable housing is going to reduce the drain on your city and county resources, right? So I think those are kind of things which we need to kind of think about, those are changes which need to happen at the policy level, but I think can have a really positive impact in terms of improving the density of accommodation, right? You're absolutely right. It's like 85% is a crazy, crazy number. And you see, there's all these folk who are working. I know, and I go past in some neighborhoods, you'll actually see folk who are living out of their cars, or living out of little caravans or whatever, right? And that's because they can't actually find a place to live. And these are all folk who are working. They lock their caravan and they go to work, or they lock their car and go to work, or drive their car to the parking lot of wherever they're working. So, that's something which we can do, which is to say, okay, fine, we don't need that revenue. Let people kind of enjoy it for 3 years or whatever, let them collect the rent, but then make sure you can put conditions to say, hey, you can't charge, exorbitant rent. You have to charge, charge them whatever the living, the minimum rent or whatever, cap their rent for whatever, so that they can at least provide housing for people. And then you can, phase in the property tax increases or whatever. So over time. So I think there are lots of these things which can be done, but, to your point, and I see this, for me, the most stark division is going across 101 from Palo Alto. On the one side, you've got a really, really wealthy neighborhood, and then you go across 101 and you're in East Palo Alto. And suddenly, your property value goes down to a third of what it is in Palo Alto, your services, everything goes, and it's just one freeway across, right? And it's all done, and propagated, in my view, by a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned people passing, rules and laws and what have you, which propagate this system.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought this up, because it's interesting. I've found over the years on working on this issue that it's almost the more boring policies that are actually the most systemically important. So you mentioned, tax policy. I mean, I mentioned earlier, like single family zoning. I mean, like that's a total snoozer, but it's like so critical to like why the housing market is the way it is. But, the property tax situation in California is such, at least in my view, a systemic problem. So for people that don't know, that might not be in California. So in the 70s, California passed something called Prop 13, which basically says when you buy your house, your property tax is going to be 1% of that purchase price forever. So you have people in California that purchased their homes in the 70s at, I don't know, $10,000, and they're paying, 1% on that cost of the house. And so I think even the East Palo Alto is a great example. And it's the same in the East Bay and in Berkeley and Oakland, which again are these like extremely progressive areas where back then, housing discrimination, like legal housing discrimination, was still the law of the land, even in the Bay Area 5 years before Prop 13 was passed. And so what was happening was that, white families could buy in these very nice suburban areas, and African-American families or other families could not. And then Prop 13 kept the taxes low for those homeowners, those white homeowners. Their home value has basically multiplied, 20x since then. Yeah. And that's financed the ability for their kids to go to college, to then give their kids home loans, to then move into their own nice neighborhoods. And so, when you talk about like wealth inequality or especially racial wealth inequality in the Bay Area, it's like something as boring as tax policy is one of the biggest drivers of inequality. And so even this fall, there's a proposition to at least repeal Prop 13 on commercial properties and to make the tax code float up to actually what the market value is. But you raise such a good point, because it's like, that's been the system for 40 years. And so how do you not hurt seniors or other people that are on a fixed income, rely on having a low property tax? So it's a very, tricky, tough issue. But again, I find it's almost those like kind of more boring policies that are actually in some way the most harmful or the most important or the most, they provide the most inertia against change. So I think those are ripe areas to look.
Yeah, definitely. You're absolutely right. And it's like, some of these things just fly under the radar and people don't pay attention to them because it's, like you said, it's boring. It's not, you can't go into a cocktail party and let's talk about housing policy and cocktail
exactly.
and tax revenues and tax policy, people's eyes will glaze over and you'll be standing alone in a corner somewhere, right? Nobody's going to talk. So, it is, but it's these things which actually make a difference. And I think we really need a public education campaign around this to say, inequality is not just words. We actually have to do something tangible about, trying to drive inequality out. And, it's a whole mix of this. I mean, I talk about Palo Alto and East Palo Alto, not just from housing. I mean, you look at the school districts. I mean, on the one side, you have the Palo Alto and you've got the Menlo Atherton school districts, which are really wealthy, beautiful schools, well-funded, fantastic teachers and what have you. And then you go across on the other side, it's like Ravenswood and Bellhaven. And, the schools, I mean, don't even have books, in their library. It's appalling. And it's, there's only so much which philanthropy can do, but I think we need to think about, just as taxpayers, what are we actually mandating our government to do as well? Because in many respects, we actually tie the hands of our governments. I mean, Prop 13 in a way has tied the hands of local government to actually do things, right? And so that's something which we really need to think about. And so, I mean, you can tell I feel a little bit passionate about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. I like that. Yeah. Well, we're down to our final question, and I think I'm really excited to see what you guys think about this. But we are doing this event with the idea that poverty is solvable, and so I want to put that to you. You're systems thinkers. You've been in the space. Do you believe that poverty is solvable, and what kind of mindset would it take to actually solve it locally?
KP, you want to start or?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I think it boils down, in my view at least, for us to think about what are some of the social constructs which we have, which propagate and continue poverty, right? So what do I mean by that? We talked about racial equality. Well, race is a social construct. There is no basis in fact for racial discrimination. So we have to think about that. Um, Consciously or unconsciously, there are many decisions which are driven by race and the discrimination of, based on race. There are many decisions which we take, and so we really have to think about, how much are we willing to pay. I lived in Scotland for many years, and I moved here, and it's like I was talking to, I have friends back there, and I was talking to them even last week, and as we're talking about, they're in the medical field, and so they're dealing with COVID and everything else. And I was talking to them, and they said, "Oh, but yeah, we've got COVID and all of that stuff, but nobody is really concerned about going into the hospital. Nobody's actually concerned about going and seeking medical help because they don't have to pay for it. It's not some, you don't have to think about where's my insurance when I come to, I need care, right? So that is something so that's a level of fear which is taken out of people. The fact that if I need medical care, there is a system which is going to take care of it, and our taxes pay for it, right? So it is fixable. There are, people say, oh, if you tax people heavily, you're going to have a really poor country and what have you. The Nordics prove us wrong, right? I mean, they're one of the most heavily taxed countries in the world. And look at the standard of living which people enjoy over there. It's just amazing, right? I mean, so we've got to really think about, there's some of these things are just driven by decades of dogma and which have got no basis in fact, right? So that's something which we need to think about. And, this lens, at Benetech, for example, we have this lens, which I think, is a really good way. I mean, think about, okay, is it inclusive? Is it equitable? Is it just, right? So those three lenses, I think, are good lenses to go look at. And we all need to go kind of look at what are the decisions you're making on our own, and what is the basis for making those decisions. And we have to inform we have to advocate for and educate and push our policymakers and decision makers and government officials whom we elect. I mean, they come from amongst us to actually do the kind of actions, the bold actions which are required to solve these problems. It's totally solvable. So it's a question of, are we prepared to take those steps? Am I, as an individual, prepared to pay another $10,000 in taxes or whatever it is? I'm just making that number up in order to have a more equitable society. That's the question which we've got to ask.
That's great. I mean, you said something at the beginning that I think for me has been a really powerful lesson that I try to keep in mind when thinking about systems. There's a great book called Thinking and Systems by Donella Meadows. And in that book, there's a chapter about, the tools that you can use to change systems. And the number one tool is simply this mindset, I think KP said well, which is that in a way, every single human cultural system is just made up. I mean, if you look at the history of the human species, there have been so many different civilizations, social models of cooperation. And so really, if you think about it, it's all made up. And so we get, I think, entrenched in this way of thinking of this is just the way it is. Mm-hmm. And I feel like actually this moment is offering a real opportunity, despite all the pain of, I think sometimes it takes coming to these breaking points of like the way the system has been constructed for the last however many, 80 years, 400 years, this is not working. And if we start to have new values or start to have new ideas or start to live in a different way, you really can change any system. And so for me, that always kind of keeps me inspired of, at any time, I think you even see it now with, the criminal justice reform movement of like overnight, you're hearing these calls for defunding the police or just basically reimagining public safety. And it's like, where did that come from? I mean, obviously like there's been a lot of, illumination on this for a number of years, but just, I feel like in the past couple of months, it's that there's this whole new opening, this whole new language, this whole new reimagining of that system. And so I think that's a great illustration of just how fast these things can change. And I just wanted to build on it. I think, KP touched on this in our last question, but I think it's key I think human beings are hardwired to be reluctant to let go of things or to feel like they're losing something. And so I think always framing a system in, what are we gaining by this? How is this new system better? And really showing the tangible benefits. I think that can be really impactful in selling the change. That's what I found. I mean, that was what we found with chronic homelessness, is this, we were promising, if we solve homelessness in this way, all these pain points that you have are going to go away. And so it was ironic. It wasn't really about the ethics of this is the right thing to do. And it was the ethical thing to do. But a lot of it was, what is this community? What's the stakeholder group? What are you going to gain by this new change system? So yeah, I think that keeps me inspired, at least.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been an incredible conversation that I think we just need to continue. But this is a great, just a few kind of actionable pieces that I think people that are new to this framework can at least drop into your thinking and maybe incorporate some of that as they're building. So it's really helpful. So thank you both so much. And hope to see you at Impactathon. Looking forward to that.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you, Lisa, for having me. And Andrew, it's absolutely fascinating what you had to say, and I'd love to stay connected. I think I'm working with some organizations in Marin, so I think we have a little bit of overlap over there, definitely. Yeah. So, with CA Marin and so on. So definitely, I'd love to stay in touch and see how we can work together. So
yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I really appreciate you convening us, Nital, and it's always good seeing you. And KP, what a great conversation. I'm like, how's it been an hour? We got to keep it going.
I really think this is what ecosystem building is. Now you guys go meet each other, create some solutions, and it just keeps going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Bye.